In the heart of suburbia, where life seemed idyllic and untroubled, an unremarkable fence became the battleground for a feud that simmered for years. It all began with a shared fence, a line drawn in the earth to divide property, but one that would also divide lives. On one side, the Thompsons, a couple with young children who cherished their garden. On the other, the Williamses, longtime homeowners who valued their view and their peace. What started as small complaints over fence repairs spiraled into something no one could have predicted. This wasn't just an argument over land. It was a collision of pride, anger, and years of pent-up resentment. And it ended with one man dead, another in handcuffs, and two families shattered forever. But how does a minor grievance, something so seemingly trivial, escalate into deadly violence? What makes ordinary people cross the line into unimaginable acts? And could it have been prevented? Tonight, we unravel the story of the Thompsons and the Williamses, a tale of neighborly ties strained to the breaking point. What drove these families from neighborly tension to bloodshed? And what does it reveal about the hidden dangers of unresolved conflict? As we dive into this gripping case, prepare to question just how thin the veneer of civility can be. Because, in the end, it's often not the big things that undo us, but the small ones we let fester. If you enjoy real-life crime stories that dig into the unexpected, make sure to subscribe to Horror and Crime and hit the bell icon to never miss a chilling tale like this one. The cul-de-sac on Maplewood Drive was everything you'd imagine about suburban life. A place where neighbors waved politely, children played in front yards, and the biggest concern seemed to be who would host the next block party. But behind the facade of normalcy, two families were inching toward a breaking point. On one side of the street stood the Thompsons, a young family with two small children. Jason Thompson was a landscape architect, known for his attention to detail and pride in his home. His wife, Emily, worked part-time as a preschool teacher and devoted her free hours to their garden, which had become the envy of the neighborhood. Their love for their outdoor space was more than a hobby. It was their retreat, a sanctuary they had worked tirelessly to maintain. Directly next door were the Williamses, a retired couple who had lived on Maplewood Drive for over 30 years. Henry Williams, a former contractor, prided himself on knowing every detail of his property, from the materials of the fence to the height of his hedges. His wife, Martha, was an active member of the local homeowners association, ensuring the neighborhood stayed as picturesque as it had always been. At first, the families were cordial, sharing recipes, exchanging holiday cards, and even hosting the occasional barbecue together. But as the years went on, small disagreements began to pile up, like leaves clogging a drain. Their troubles began with the fence. While seemingly trivial, the boundary line symbolized something much deeper for both families: control over their space. The Thompsons wanted to grow vines along the fence for privacy, while the Williamses insisted it was their responsibility to maintain its structural integrity. Every disagreement seemed minor in isolation: a fallen branch, a paint color, a stray garden hose. But together, they became the seeds of mistrust. What once was a neighborly rapport turned into avoidance. Soon, they stopped waving. Then, they stopped speaking altogether. Then came the shed. Jason and Emily Thompson, eager to expand their storage space, applied for a permit to build a large structure in their backyard. To them, it was a practical addition. To the Williamses, it was an insult. The shed, they argued, would block their sunlight and disrupt the harmony of the neighborhood. Henry Williams was particularly incensed. He saw the shed as a violation of unspoken agreements and took it upon himself to challenge the Thompsons at every turn, filing complaints, writing letters to the city council, and even calling in inspectors to review their permits. The tension spilled over into shouting matches at property lines, accusations of sabotage, and escalating hostility. What had begun as a shared annoyance over a fence had now become a war of principle. Neighbors began to notice the animosity, whispering about the feud that seemed to grow more heated with every passing day. But no one could have imagined how far it would go. As grievances festered, the feud took on a life of its own, pushing both families toward an unthinkable confrontation. Two families, one shared fence, a storm of pride, anger, and unresolved disputes. This was no longer just a clash of personalities. It was a ticking time bomb, and it was about to explode. By the spring of 2022, the feud had reached its breaking point. The construction of the Thompson shed was complete, towering over the shared fence like a silent provocateur. The Williamses, furious over what they called an eyesore, claimed it violated local zoning regulations. Meanwhile, the Thompsons dismissed the complaints as petty interference. The tension between the families was no longer confined to words or written complaints. What had once been verbal disputes now became acts of defiance. Henry began leaving his porch lights on all night, shining directly into the Thompsons' bedroom. Jason retaliated by planting tall shrubs that blocked the Williamses' view. Each act of retaliation escalated the conflict, creating an atmosphere of constant hostility. But on the evening of June 18th, everything changed. What started as another argument quickly spiraled into an irreparable tragedy. That night, Henry Williams confronted Jason Thompson about the shed once again, this time accusing him of violating noise ordinances. The argument that followed was louder and more heated than anything the neighbors had ever heard. Emily Thompson, hearing the commotion, came outside to defuse the situation, but her presence only seemed to fuel Henry's anger. Witnesses later described his demeanor as erratic, his words growing more threatening with each passing moment. Henry's wife, Martha, tried to pull him away, but the argument had already escalated beyond reason. Jason, frustrated and unwilling to back down, made a comment that would later haunt the neighborhood. "What are you going to do, Henry? Call the cops again?" What happened next stunned everyone. Henry disappeared into his home, and for a moment, the neighborhood fell silent. But when he emerged, he was holding something that would change everything: a gun. Jason, perhaps believing it was an empty threat, refused to back down. He stepped closer to the fence, continuing to argue, even as Emily screamed for him to come inside. At 6:45 p.m., a shot echoed through the quiet cul-de-sac, shattering the fragile peace forever. Jason Thompson collapsed onto the ground, the life draining from him as Emily called for help. Neighbors rushed outside, horrified by what they saw. Within minutes, the street was swarming with police officers and paramedics. Jason was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead on arrival, leaving behind a wife, 2 children, and a neighborhood in shock. Henry Williams was arrested at the scene, still holding the gun. His wife, Martha, stood on the porch, trembling as officers questioned her. According to reports, Henry claimed he had acted in self-defense, though witnesses described a very different story. A quiet neighborhood in Maplewood is reeling tonight after a dispute between neighbors turned deadly. Henry Williams, 64, is now in custody, charged with the murder of Jason Thompson, 36. In less than 15 minutes, years of resentment and hostility had culminated in an act of violence that no one could undo. A single decision, made in the heat of anger, tore 2 families apart and left an entire community grappling with the question: how did it come to this? But the story doesn't end there. What evidence would investigators uncover? Would Henry's claim of self-defense hold up in court? And how did the neighborhood, once so peaceful, come to terms with the loss of life and the scars left behind? The death of Jason Thompson sent shockwaves through Maplewood Drive. A neighborhood once defined by its quiet streets and manicured lawns was now a crime scene. As investigators pieced together what had happened, questions about the events leading up to the shooting began to emerge. From the very beginning, police were skeptical of Henry Williams's claim of self-defense. The position of Jason's body, the proximity of the fence, and the angle of the bullet raised doubts about whether Henry had truly acted out of fear, or if it was something far more deliberate. Emily Thompson was the first to be interviewed. She recounted the argument, her desperate pleas for Jason to come inside, and the moment Henry emerged from his house with a gun. Her testimony painted a harrowing picture of a confrontation that had escalated beyond control. He didn't even hesitate. Jason wasn't attacking him. He wasn't even on their property. Henry just shot him. Meanwhile, Henry Williams maintained that he had acted to protect himself and his wife, claiming Jason had crossed onto their property and threatened him. But investigators found inconsistencies in his account. The physical evidence told a different story. The gun was legally owned by Henry, but it had been kept loaded in his home, an indication that he may have anticipated a confrontation. Ballistics experts determined the bullet trajectory suggested Jason had been standing several feet back, near his own side of the fence, when he was shot. The crime scene reconstruction was damning. It showed that Jason was unarmed and standing on his own property when the shot was fired. Investigators began to suspect that Henry's actions were not out of fear, but rather out of anger. Adding to their suspicions was a note discovered in Henry's home. Though it wasn't addressed to anyone specifically, its tone suggested a deep-seated frustration with the Thompsons and a mindset teetering on the edge. Neighbors corroborated the growing animosity between the two families. Many described Henry as increasingly hostile in recent months, with one neighbor recalling an ominous comment Henry had made during a block party. "If they keep pushing me, they'll regret it." As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that this was not an open and shut case of self-defense. Henry Williams was charged with second-degree murder, a decision that divided the community. Some viewed him as a man pushed to his breaking point, while others saw him as a cold-blooded killer. In a case that has captivated the nation, Henry Williams now faces charges that could put him behind bars for life. But the most shocking discovery came in the weeks leading up to the trial. A search of Henry's computer revealed emails he had sent to local officials, threatening to take matters into his own hands if the city didn't force the Thompsons to remove the shed. These emails, prosecutors argued, showed premeditation and undermined his claim of self-defense. The evidence against Henry continued to mount, leaving little doubt that his actions were not born out of fear, but out of a simmering rage that had finally boiled over. As the case headed to trial, the spotlight shifted to the courtroom, where both families would face the full weight of the law and the truth. Would Henry Williams's defense hold up under scrutiny? Or would the evidence prove that a petty feud had driven him to murder? And how would the Thompsons' grief and the Williamses' shame play out in the courtroom? On a rainy Monday morning, the trial of Henry Williams began. It was a case that had captivated the public, not only because of its shocking nature, but because it reflected the dangers of unchecked anger and unresolved conflict. As the prosecution and defense prepared their opening statements, the courtroom brimmed with tension. The prosecution wasted no time painting Henry Williams as a man consumed by rage. They argued that his years-long feud with the Thompsons had turned into an obsession and that the emails he sent to city officials, combined with a note found in his home, were evidence of premeditation. This was not an act of self-defense. This was an act of vengeance. Henry Williams planned this, and Jason Thompson paid the ultimate price. The defense, however, offered a starkly different narrative. They described Henry as a man pushed to his breaking point by what they called the Thompsons' blatant disregard for his rights as a property owner. They argued that the shooting was a tragic but unintentional act, driven by fear and provocation. This was not a calculated murder. This was an impulsive reaction from a man who felt threatened and cornered. Key to the prosecution's case was the crime scene reconstruction. It demonstrated that Jason Thompson had been standing on his own property when he was shot, contradicting Henry's claim that Jason had crossed the fence line. This detail, prosecutors argued, made Henry's actions indefensible. He wasn't doing anything aggressive. He was just standing there, arguing like they always did. Then I heard the gunshot. Emily Thompson's testimony was one of the most powerful moments of the trial. She described the events of that night in painful detail, her voice breaking as she recounted her husband's final moments. He didn't even see it coming. He thought it was just another argument. I begged him to come inside, but he didn't listen, and now he's gone. The Williams family also took the stand, offering a glimpse into Henry's mindset leading up to the shooting. Martha Williams described her husband as a man deeply frustrated and overwhelmed, but she stopped short of justifying his actions. He wasn't himself those last few months. He felt like he was losing control over everything. But I never thought he would do something like this. In their closing arguments, the prosecution urged the jury to focus on the evidence, particularly the emails and the trajectory of the bullet. The defense pleaded for empathy, asking the jury to consider Henry's age, his state of mind, and what they called the toxic environment created by both families. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are now tasked with deciding whether Henry Williams is guilty of second-degree murder or acted in self-defense. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of second-degree murder. The courtroom fell silent as the judge announced Henry Williams's sentence, 25 years to life in prison. While justice had been served, the verdict brought little solace to the neighborhood. Jason Thompson was gone, leaving behind a grieving widow and 2 children. Henry Williams, once a respected member of the community, would spend the rest of his life behind bars, and Maplewood Drive would forever be haunted by the tragedy. Neighbors described the aftermath as a wake-up call, a reminder of how small conflicts can spiral out of control if left unresolved. Some called for stronger community mediation programs, while others simply wished to move on and forget. But for the families involved, there was no moving on. For the Thompsons, the loss was immeasurable. For the Williamses, the shame was insurmountable. And for the rest of us, the story serves as a chilling reminder of how quickly a neighborly dispute can turn into a nightmare. The trial had ended, but the scars left on Maplewood Drive would never fully heal. 2 families, once neighbors, were now bound together forever, not by proximity, but by tragedy. As we close the chapter on the tragedy of Maplewood Drive, we are left with more questions than answers. How does a disagreement over a fence spiral into deadly violence? And how can we prevent similar conflicts from consuming our own lives? This case reminds us of the fragile nature of human relationships and the devastating consequences of unresolved anger. It's a stark example of how pride and unchecked emotions can lead to irreparable loss. But the story isn't just about the Thompsons and the Williamses. It's about all of us, about the small grievances we let fester and the divides we fail to bridge. What could have been done to stop this? Could the intervention of neighbors, mediators, or authorities have made a difference? Let this story be a reminder. The lines that divide us are often smaller than we think. A shared fence became the backdrop for tragedy, but it didn't have to end this way. Perhaps the greatest lesson we can take is to seek resolution before conflict becomes irreversible. If this story has resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. How can you resolve tension in your own life? And what steps can we all take to foster understanding, even in the face of conflict? If you're captivated by stories like this one, subscribe to Horror and Crime, Deep Secrets. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful tales to light. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think could have been done differently in this case? Next time, we take you into the chilling world of online dating. For one woman, a blind date held the promise of love, but it quickly became a fight for survival. What started as an innocent search for connection unraveled into a nightmare, as she discovered her date's disturbing obsession and his terrifying plan to make her disappear. Join us for the blind date horror, when a search for love turns into a fight for survival. A tale of courage, cunning, and the dangers that lurk in the digital age. Subscribe now and hit the bell icon to make sure you don't miss it.